Thank you for viewing our video. We need to say a few words about safety right up front. Safety is an important factor to consider before using any of the information contained in our materials. Please know the information contained in this video is not a substitute for professional contractor services. You should contact professionals and/or experts for assistance and advice as necessary to safely and properly complete any implementation of the methods and systems described in this video. To that end, please remember to review and obey your local laws and codes. Now, the following is a disclaimer from our lawyers. Please review it before proceeding. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Brian Clark, and we're on location here in Boulder, Colorado, where today we'll be showing you how to build your own solar panel capable of producing 75 watts for under $100. So we'll outline the different materials and methods that you'll be using today to build that panel, and then we'll show you what you can do with your finished product once you're done. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the different tools that are necessary to build your solar panel. We're building the panel with a wooden frame, so you want something to cut the wood with. I've opted to use a skill saw to speed up the process. You can use a regular hand saw if you choose. And then also I've got a battery operated drill. I like to use pilot holes when I'm cutting, especially with plexiglass, to one, ensure that they're going to line up properly, and two, you don't want to cut the glass and shatter it by mistake. So underneath of here we've got all of the drill bits necessary to do that, and then here we've got the battery charger, and then also a very important spare battery. When you're using battery powered tools, they tend to drain the batteries pretty quickly, so to have a second one on hand is very, very key. Over here I've got a piece of sandpaper and an electric sander. This is actually powered through a cord, so you know, it helps to be close to an outlet, but if you are not in an outlet, go ahead and just, sand things by hand, just to kind of leave a nice smooth finish. Here's a caulk gun and some gloves. We're using silicone, liquid silicone caulk, which can get quite messy, so it helps to have gloves. And also when you're cutting, it's good to have a mask on because you're going to have a lot of sawdust kicking up. So onto the multimeter, you want to make sure that it can measure both volts and amps. So you can get them fairly cheap, and you just want to make sure when you're measuring the cells that you can get both of those. So here is our soldering gun. Low wattage is the best. These solar cells are very fragile, so you want to make sure that it's not going to get too hot and it's not going to draw too much power. And another reason to wear the mask is when you're soldering, when you get the different flux and tin, it creates kind of a putrid smell. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of respiratory protection. So just on to some more generic tools. We've got screws. Stainless steel screws are the best to use because they're the most tolerant of conditions. And also a good way to make sure that they're stainless steel is to get a magnet and just push the magnet next to them. If they're attracted to the magnet, they're not stainless steel. If they don't have any attraction to the magnet, they're stainless steel. Next we have a level, some wire strippers, and Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. Mainly I'm using the flathead just to open the paint, but it's good to have on hand. Some clamps to keep your connections together. Just a little kind of a scissor plier kind of thing. It's got a really fine point, which is good for, we're going to be crimping the tab ribbon. So you want to make sure something like that will work. Fine point needle nose pliers would work as well. Just a pencil, X-Acto knife, and this is a plexiglass cutter where it's used to score the plexiglass, and then you put it on an edge and you can break it off quite easily. We've got a speed square here, which aids in making sure you got some 90-degree corners. Measuring tape, which again will help make sure you've got the right dimensions. You can't do anything without a hammer when you're doing carpentry. And we've got the paintbrush, obviously, to paint. Very important eye protection here. It's almost paramount that you wear these anytime you're dealing with power tools. And even when you're soldering, you know, it's quite possible to have little flecks of tin come up. So you want to make sure that you're wearing those almost the whole time you're building this panel. And last but not least, we've got our testing block here, where you're going to be using it to test the cells to make sure that they've got the proper readings. So next we'll go into the different materials that we'll be using to construct your solar panel. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different materials that we'll be using here. As you can see, there are much fewer materials than tools. That's basically because these cells are going to comprise almost all of the panel. Everything else is just used to wire them together and to weatherproof them. The cells come in two different varieties here. You can get them with the tab ribbons already attached, or you can get them without the tab ribbons attached. So to get the tab panels, you're going to pay a little bit more, but you're not going to have to work as hard. When you get them untabbed, you're going to have to actually take these tab ribbons and solder them to the front of the panels, and you'll still have to make the back connection. Here we've got the wire that we'll be using to connect the panels at the ends of the strings together, and then these will be the home runs, as I like to call them, the wires that come out of the panel at the end. You can use a really low gauge here. In the panel that we'll be building, the amperage, the current won't be much more than 4 amps, and the voltage shouldn't exceed much more than 20 volts. So, you know, a really small wire could be fine, even speaker wire you could use. I've used the red and black for the positive and negative, and you want to get something that's very malleable, that you can bend quite easily. It's just easier to work with. I prefer stranded wire over the bare copper wire if you have the choice. Now, when you've got the home runs coming out of the panel, you're basically going to have a positive and a negative wire. They're going to be live anytime the panel is exposed to any sort of light at all. So you want to make sure that you've got some electric tape and that you wrap the ends of both the positive and negative wires so that they're secure and, you know, as safe as possible. Here we've got, these little things are called blocking diodes. We're going to be wiring them in series on the positive wire coming out of the panel. That basically prevents current from flowing back into the panel. The reason that these are important is that if you spend all day with a deep cycle battery and you charge it up during the day, at nighttime, without a blocking diode, that current is just going to flow back into the panel and drain the batteries. So you definitely want to have one of these. Side note, if you're going to be using a charge controller, you can actually get by without using a blocking diode. Just keep that in mind. Here we've got our flux soldering paste mixture that we'll be using when we're doing the soldering on the contacts. Over here we've got the solder, and that is a 6040 Rosencore leaded solder mix. So keep in mind that it contains tin and lead. So again, you want to make sure that you've got some sort of respiratory protection when you're working with it, as the fumes can be quite noxious and give you a headache. Here we've got some glue. You know, any sort of wood glue will work. I prefer to, when we're building the frame, just use a little bit of glue to keep some of the points together. When you go back later to screw them together, you know, the connection's already made, and you know that your corners are going to be nice and tight. Here we've got two types of caulk. This is kind of a cheaper version of caulk. And, you know, this can work, but what I prefer is to spend the extra $1 or $2 and go with the Silicone 2 caulk. This is going to provide you with the best protection from the elements, because once you've built this panel, you don't want moisture getting into the panel. Any sort of condensation that will arise in the morning will reduce the life of the panels, and it will just reduce the efficiency. You know, if there's water droplets on the inside of the glass, you're not going to be getting clear sun into those solar cells. So it's really important that you make sure that you've got that panel nice and sealed up. And here we've got paint. You know, again, we're using wood for this panel, and, you know, wood is going to deteriorate from the UV over time and from the elements. So you want to make sure that you give it a couple coats of primer and then go back afterwards with a couple coats of UV protected paint. And that just basically seals it from the elements so that it's not going to rot from the inside out and will add years to the life of your panel. Okay, so now we're going to do a brief tutorial on how to use a multimeter. You want to make sure that it's a multimeter because you want to be measuring your voltage and your current, or amps. So to start off, you want to make sure it's in the off position, and then you take your black lead, plug it into the black COM port here, and then you take the red and plug it into, you can see a V here for voltage, so I plug it into here. You've got the positive and the negative leads, and you turn it on to the volt over here. If you're measuring something between 20 and 200 volts, I go with the 200. So then you take your leads, the red's positive, you put that onto the positive, the black is negative, and you put that onto the negative. And then you've got your circuit, and it'll give you the reading. So before you take them out, put it back to off, remove the leads, and you've just measured your voltage. Now to measure the current, or amps, you do the exact same thing with the black lead. You put it back into the COM port, and you take the red one and put it into the amp over here. A standing for amp. And now you take this, and instead of putting it to the voltage area, you're going to put it into the amp area. So that's the A over here. So you bring it down, and you've got it right there. And you want to make sure that it's on the DC side, which volts and amps over here are both on the DC side. So now you've got the proper port here, and you've got the proper dial here. And you do the exact same thing measuring the voltage. You just take the red for the positive and the black for the negative. And then you've got your circuit and you've got your reading. And again, before you turn it off, or before you remove the leads, turn it off, pull them out. So what we've got here is a solar cell. And as you can see, it's got the front side and the back side. There are electrodes on the front, which is where the flow of electrons leaves the panel. And then on the back side, there are 3 contact points, which we'll be getting into further on how to work with those. So the front of the panel is negative. I like to think, because it's blue, and blue is kind of a negative feeling, that's how I remember that negative is on the front, and positive is on the back. So in order to test this, you want to put these leads, the negative one, which is black, on the front, and the positive one, which is red, on the back. So because it's so hard to hold the fragile solar cell in your hands and hit the front and back contact points to get the reading, I've created what I call a testing block, which is essentially just a highly conductive piece of copper, so that when you lay the panel flat against it, when you lay the cell flat against it, you'll get the same reading by touching this point as you will by touching the back contact. And it's essentially just a piece of copper, and it's just attached to a substrate and a little resting block here, just with 2 screws. Nothing fancy. And now what we can do is hitting the front contact the same as we would have before, but now all we have to do is just touch the copper to get the reading. And you can see we're looking at over 3 amps, which is good. And it'll fluctuate a lot as the intensity of the sun and the clouds, certain atmospheric particulates will affect that. All right, well, we're here now with our panel box, which, as you can see, I constructed it off scene a little bit. I think the only thing more boring than watching paint dry is to watch someone else watch paint dry. So I went ahead and got my dimensions from taking the solar cell. So whatever cells you get your hands on, you want to figure out the length and the width of these cells. And then you want to pretty much figure out how many you want to put together to give you the right voltage. Well, our cells, we wanted to get up to 18 volts, so we had to put 36 of them in series. There are two options, two more popular options, we'll call it that. One is to do it with 4 rows of 9. So you have 9, 18, 27, 36. Bam, we got our 36 cells, 18 volts. The other option would be to do 3 rows of 12. So you go 12, 12, and 12, so it gives you 36. You know, either one would work just fine. What I had found when I went out to the lumber yard is I was able to find some scrap materials that were more of a square shape, so they would work better with the 4 rows of 9. That's pretty much the only reason I didn't do 3 rows of 12. And again, if you find a longer, skinnier piece of wood and you want to use that, feel free. So that was my limitations there. So I've got just, you know, a piece of plywood on the back. I've given it multiple coats of primer. And I've gotten the first coat of the UV protective paint on there. So as you can see, a little bit of the primer is still bleeding through, so I'm going to want to go back and give it one more coat at least. And like I said in the intro, the more coats the better. You don't ever want to, you know, undercoat it, because this is your main sealant against the forces of nature. And you know, if one thing's gonna last, it's the cells are gonna last a long time. So you want to make sure that that wood can keep up with it. So I've just taken some wood strips here and put them along the outside. That basically provides a little bit of an enclosure that the cells can be inside of, because you really want to protect them from the elements as well. I chose to just go ahead and glue them down and then put a C-clamp on them just to keep them in place. I'm going to go back later and screw them when I have the actual plexiglass on top. But you know, I didn't want just to have a bunch of screws sticking out everywhere, so I figured I'd just glue them down now, thin strip of glue, just a little bead. And then when I go back and screw them, they'll already be in place, and then it'll just give a more aesthetic appearance to it. So essentially, once you've built this and you've got it painted, you take what is called your substrate, and this you want to make sure that it is small enough to fit inside of the panel box, but then big enough to accommodate your cells. This is what the cells are going to be attached to. So this is big enough to accommodate 9 cells like this and 4 wide. That is the main thing that you need to make sure. If the cells are sticking out, it's not going to work. So you essentially build this, same process. You want to make sure it's primed and painted. And this is going to be where the cells will attach to, and then you're going to attach this to the panel box. And again, you know, whatever you can get your hands on, whether it be free or cheap, you know, this is one area that you can be creative with, building the panel box. And you know, you're not looking to spend much money on building this, because you can usually find reclaimed timber for next to nothing, if not free. So this next portion here is the front cover. You know, I like to keep the plastic on it until I'm ready to work, because it keeps it from getting scratched. One other thing is you want to make sure that it is UV protected. This right here, this plexiglass acrylic sheet, actually has a 10-year limited warranty to mitigate any yellowing. So if you get standard regular plexiglass, it's going to yellow on you really quickly. You want to make sure that it's made to be exposed to the sun. If it starts to yellow, you're going to lose a lot of power. So basically, you know, you just get your hands on a standard sheet, and once you've built the box, you just figure out your dimensions and you cut the sheet down to size. So that pretty much takes care of the box. Pretty easy, pretty simple. And from here, we'll go on to the soldering.
Thank you for viewing our video. We need to say a few words about safety right up front. Safety is an important factor to consider before using any of the information contained in our materials. Please know the information contained in this video is not a substitute for professional contractor services. You should contact professionals and/or experts for assistance and advice as necessary to safely and properly complete any implementation of the methods and systems described in this video. To that end, please remember to review and obey your local laws and codes. Now, the following is a disclaimer from our lawyers. Please review it before proceeding. Thanks.
Okay, so now we've got your panel box all assembled. Now for the exciting part, we're going to actually do some soldering of the solar cells together. So I've got my equipment here. I've got a soldering gun. I've got the solder here and the flux. And this little pin is just to kind of help keep the tabs down as you're soldering, which you'll see in a minute. So again, safety first. Make sure to keep those eye protective goggles on. And then, as you can see, I've doubled up. I'm not using a respirator, so I'm going to double up these. If you have a respirator, certainly this would be a good time to go grab it and put it on. So you're going to start with the first cell, and being very, very ginger with them. They're extremely fragile, and you want to avoid touching the fronts of them. I just washed my hands. You want to make sure your hands are very clean. If any of the solder gets on them or the flux, you're going to leave a fingerprint that will not come off. And it may not affect the performance so much of the cell, but it's just going to be glaring. Every time you see the panel, that's what you're going to see. So I lay it face down because what we're trying to get are the back contacts here. So I just kind of use my finger to get the tabs kind of lined up so that they're in line with the contacts. And there's a variety of ways to make sure that these are in line. You could, you can build spacers, you can build a grid pattern, or you can just eyeball it. I'm going with the latter. I'm going to eyeball it. Basically, you just want to make sure some of the cells, the specs are a little different, so just make sure that the contact points are lined up. You don't have to worry about the edges being lined up because they're going to vary. So basically, you've got your soldering gun here, and you dip it in to the flux. Now you see all that smoke coming up? I don't want to breathe that. So after you put the flux on there, you take a little bit of this solder, and one thing, if you want to keep the tip lasting as long as you can, try not to hit the same portion of it with the solder every time. That's actually going to create a weak spot, and that's the first part that'll deteriorate. And also, after you're done using it, you want to coat it with a little bit of the lead and tin solder, because that will keep it from oxidizing. So just a little tip on how to keep the soldering gun tip lasting longer. So there's there's two ways to do it. One way is to actually take the ribbon, the tab, if you will, and put it down on the contact strip, and then use the solder gun and kind of apply it. I find that that's a little bit slower than just taking the solder gun and just touching the tab. Now what will happen is the solder will actually come off of the gun and it will go on to the tab. And you want to do it 3 times so that you can imagine if it's laid down, you're putting the solder where it will be contacting the contacts. And for the purpose of this video, I'm going to kind of leave this off most of the time. However, when you're at home doing this, you want to keep this on or a respirator because, trust me, it'll give you a headache if you don't. So every time you do that, I like to dip it back in the flux. You just put a little on there. Then you just go ahead and hit the tabs. And you can see the solder deposit on the tabs. And if there's resistance, if it's not depositing well, just put a little more flux, a little more solder. And sometimes the flux will discolor the backside. Don't be discouraged, it's not going to show through or affect the performance, but you do want to make sure that you're not going to push too much pressure and too much heat to actually burn the cell, which is possible to happen. But this kind of discoloration, I wouldn't worry about. You want to work your way up. And that's good enough. It's actually more than we'd need. You know, realistically, if it doesn't move, it's soldered, but I like to have a little visual so that I know that that connection has been made. And you'll get the hang of it. It doesn't take too long to pick it up. And don't get frustrated if you break a couple cells learning. Just know you don't need to really apply much pressure. Let the heat do the job. So I hit a little bit more flux there. Put a little bit more solder there in the tip. And we've got our first two strung together. Now, two things I want to show you is one, you can see how little solder it really takes to make that connection. You know, there's not much current coming out of these, so they don't need a large pathway to go. Just a little bit. And two, when they're down, they'll move in relation to each other. When you get them out of the box, they're straight. If you attach straight tabs to each other, there's going to be no room for contraction and expansion. You know, as the sun comes out and it heats up, different metals and plastics heat up at different paces. So you want to allow them to be able to kind of move and flex with each other. So I will just take the string, the tab that comes out, and I bend it down. So I get in there nice and close to the cell. I bend it down, then I push it back up around it. I take it and apply it the other way, and then smooth it out. So what that gives you is almost like a little riverbed valley, and that right there allows it to spread out and contract. So let's flip these back over, and we'll do one more. So again, you want to line them up nice and straight. Take your next one, be very careful. And like I said, try not to touch the faces of these cells because anything that gets onto them, you're going to have a really, really hard time getting off. So, and by the way, this little workspace of mine is just leftover plywood from the actual panel box that I've just thrown an old towel on there, just to kind of give it a little matting in case the panels shift a little bit. If there are surface impurities in the wood, it might scratch it a little bit. So I just like to use a nice old towel, and definitely make it old because you know, you're going to get little solder flecks on it. So you know, definitely don't use anything that you want to keep around. And I can already start to feel the cells heating up just in the couple minutes they've been in the sun here. So again, flux and solder, trying to avoid hitting the same spot every time with that solder. And then just lightly touch the ribbons. And the flux is basically just, cleaning it as it goes along, and you'll know when you don't have flux because you'll have a hard time getting the solder to come off the tab. It'll just stay on the tab and it'll kind of ball up. That's when you know that you're not using enough flux. So again, you just make those connections. Really trying to keep everything in line. And again, you can see I'm working from the contact point all the way up to the next one. So that ensures that since the tabs are really conductive to the heat, that by the time I get up there, the tabs actually heated the solder in it and it's ready to get moved onto the contact. So this is a good example of me needing more flux. There's solder on there, but it's not coming off. So just dab it in there. It's another good way to check to make sure your gun's hot. If you hear the sizzle, you know you're hot. So I just got a little bit more solder on there. You always want to use this tool when you're hitting the contacts, because if you don't, the tab will actually stick to this and you'll pull it all the way up. So just start back here, work your way up, and there we are, we're connected. So, as you can see, before I'm putting it away, get a little flux, put a little solder on there, and that prevents it from oxidizing. And now we've got essentially 3 wired in series. So basically you do this depending on whether you're doing 4 rows of 9, as I mentioned, or 3 rows of 12. You want to do that until you finish your entire string. Now when you get to the very top, you're going to be left with this extra ribbon that you're not going to need, because you'll only need maybe an inch or 2 of it. So you can actually take that, cut it, and then use that to connect these 3 back ones. Because since we're not going to have the front of another panel, of another cell coming into this, we're going to need to get some ribbon, some tab ribbon, so that we can have a lead coming off of this. And we'll go into that a little bit further. And one final thing is, if for some reason you're building your panel, you've got them laid out, and you break one, or you realize that you soldered it together askew, not a problem. It's a very, very simple solution. The same way that you put it on, you can take it off. You basically just, you look for a place where you can get a little bit of leverage underneath and just heat it up. And bam, comes off that quickly. I'll do one more for you. I don't want to erase all my work. You just heat it up. So once it's hot enough, it loses its bond and it'll let go. So I'll just put them back on. And you really want to make sure you're comfortable when you do this, because it could take a little while, especially when you're doing it for the first time. There's a little bit of a learning curve to it. So just make sure that you're nice and comfortable. You want to be in a ventilated place. If you are in a work area where there's, say, a garage door, just throw a fan or 2 near the door so it will pull the fumes out so they're not just sitting in there with you. And other than that, just make sure that no one's going to trip on the cord and send this flying, because this tip can be upwards of 900 degrees depending on what model you have. So, just make sure that you're in a secure site, and when you're done, just cover up the flux. This can just stay right in this spool, and there's a little safety light on this one, so when you unplug it, it should go off, and then just leave it enough time that it's going to be good to go. But when you think that it's nice and cool, don't touch it. Just put it in the flux. If it sizzles and smokes, then you know that it's still hot. So I'm going to do that last little bit of solder on it to keep it from oxidizing. And there you are, we've got 3 in a row. So you essentially just do that until you get your string, and then from there, we're going to lay a little bit of silicone on the backs and go ahead and put them onto the substrate. We've got our first string all done. They're all wired in series. There are 9 cells. Each of them is about a half a volt. So when you add them all together, we're looking at about 4.5 volts here. But we want to make sure to check it with the multimeter just to make sure. And also, each cell is between 3 and 3.5 amps. So that should remain constant. Remember, when you put cells in series, you're adding the voltage, but the current stays the same. It's only when you parallel them that the current rises. So we've got our testing block here. I'm going to go ahead and slide it underneath the first panel. And what I want to make sure is that I kind of slide it up enough that it's going to be resting flush on there. So got that. I will turn my multimeter onto the volt setting. And I've got my first contact here. Take my second one. So that's good. We know that the series connection should be good. And just to make sure that the cells are working properly, I'm going to go ahead and set this to off. Flip this over to the amp. Flip it back over here. Do the exact same thing. You should take a little bit more care when you're measuring the amps than the volts to avoid shading the cells, because that will affect the output reading of the current. So we're looking at about 2.2 amps, which, considering the clouds that are in the sky right now, we're over 60% of optimal, and I would say we're only at about 50% of sunshine. So I'm feeling pretty good that this string is good. So I feel confident enough that I will go ahead and start wiring my next string. And of course, after I get 4, we're done soldering them together and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're actually securing the cells to the substrate, and here's that silicone tube that I was talking about that is essentially permanently flexible, which is really good because of the thermal expansion that goes on inside the cells on almost a daily basis. So all it takes is just a little dab onto the cell. So I'm going to start up at the top, work my way down, and then I will go ahead and pull the string up and flip it over. And you don't need very much. Just a tiny little tab. Tiny little glob. It's just like that. And now I'm going to grab the top. Pull it up. And I went ahead and made the marker so that I know where to put that first panel at. It's pretty nice, pretty important to get that first panel down good, because then the rest will just fall right into place. Again, you want to make sure your hands are really clean before you do this, but you want to give just a little pressure right into the middle of the cells. You can see how it kind of moves around a little bit. That's it, just kind of working down into it. And so you do that, and you kind of, after you're done, want to make sure that everything's lined up. It looks good to the next row, and it's pretty straight and uniform. And because the way that the tabs are with that little indentation, you've got a little bit more flexibility to work with, so you can kind of move it around a little bit. So you essentially do that all the way up, and after we finish this string, we'll have all 4 down, and we'll be ready to wire the series together. Okay, so now we've got what resembles a panel. We've flipped them over, we've laid them down, and they're actually connected now to the substrate. However, I did leave this one, as an example, unconnected. So what we're looking at is the power coming in here, and instead of it just being one long row of 36, it goes through here and around. So essentially, we need to connect these two, and these two in series to provide that same circuit and leave it unbroken. Well, how do we do that? Because when we wire the panels together, one end has no soldering tabs. The other end has the 2 sticking out, here and here. Well, what I've done, and I like to use this knife to lift up the cells because it's very thin and you can get underneath of them very well. I left this one available so I could flip it up to show you. Just take another piece of the tab ribbon and just solder it to the back so that it comes off the bottom of the cell, so it's a positive lead. So now you've got a lead coming off the bottom of this one, which is positive, and the leads coming off the top of this one, which is negative. Well, what we do is we connect these together. That creates a series circuit, and it keeps the panel moving in that continuous flow. Because remember, you want that continuous flow to flow all the way through the panel, and in order to achieve that, we need to connect the strings together. So we'll go ahead and we'll prep some wire for this. And again, I prefer stranded over bare copper just because it's a little bit more flexible and easier to work with. But you know, you can use some more of the tab ribbon, or thicker bus ribbon would work as well. You know, but I just happen to have some wire, so you know, that's what I'm going to work with. It'll work just fine. So let's go ahead and get the copper wire out and start prepping that. Okay, now I've grabbed this copper here, and we're essentially going to be taking this. We're going to start on this end of the panel and work over. This is the negative lead coming in, so we're going to be using red for negative and white for positive. You know, ideally it's good to kind of stay uniform with what you're using, but you can really use any color for anything. I like to keep white as positive because that's kind of recognized. If someone were to stumble upon it and see a white wire, they would assume it was positive. So we're going to basically be measuring from this point to that point, and that's where we're going to kind of cut into it so that there's bare copper, and then we're going to stretch it over. This is where our 2 wires are going to leave the panel out the back, and that's where they're going to be, you know, providing energy outside of the main panel box. So to start off, what we're going to do is we're just going to very carefully mark from here to where we're going to need to cut this. And instead of a pencil, I'm using a pen because it shows up better on this. Pencil actually doesn't show up at all. So, now that you've got that, I'd like to take that knife again that was good for lifting up the solar cells and just kind of go just about, I don't know, 1/8 an inch, maybe 1/4 inch on either side, and just kind of work with it and cut around. And this kind of requires a little versatility. If you want to go ahead and use the wire cutters, you can, but I actually feel that these knives do it a little bit quicker. So I just cut a nice round loop on either side, and then I cut kind of in between them. And just like that. You've got a little spot here where the tab will connect to it. And then I will take this, we're looking at 14 gauge, so you fit it into the 14 gauge hole. And make sure that the knife, when you're done with it, you close it up. And then just kind of run this around. And then make sure that you're kind of far away from the solder gun, which is on right now, and from the cells. And just get a nice grip and pull it off. That strips the insulation off. And from here, we have got the two connections. And then I'd like to run this to basically where we're going to build that hole, where we're going to drill the hole in. And then I just like to make a nice angle because I want this to stay as flush as possible. So I want a nice tight angle so it'll just be able to go right into that hole. So from this step, we're essentially taking the wire, and one important thing to keep in mind is that you want to keep it far enough above the top of the cell so that you can connect these two. So you want to allow enough space for another wire to go in between the cells. So once you're up here, you can use that knife again to get up underneath the tabs. You can see this one a little bit better. So I like to really wrap it around to make a nice connection so that when you let go, it won't really move anywhere. The hard part is done. So now you just take the soldering gun and then basically just apply a little pressure downward and just go ahead and lay the solder on there. Now you've got a solid connection. So we'll go back with more silicone and actually secure them down. But now this is our negative home run, as I called it before. And it will be going through this hole when we have it. And then you'll have this length of wire coming out the back of the panel. And we'll strip this end, and then we'll have an open spot to work with. Okay, so here's the wire that you've seen me solder in. So essentially, we'll just start here and work our way through the system. So we've got the red wire, which is the negative, and that is coming in here. And there are the 2 points that we've made. So we're in series now. We're beginning our first of 36 panels. So again, we're coming here, we're heading up the panel, and again, it's going from front to back, kind of like a dolphin in and out of the water. And it goes all the way down the string, and then it's got another piece of copper. And it's essentially the same as here, where I stripped out the both ends and a little bit in the middle for the tab to come in, and wrapped it around nice and tight and soldered it down. So essentially, like I was mentioning, instead of having 36 cells in one long row, we've got to wrap it around. So that this wire essentially gives the bend. So now we're on our second string. We're still on the same, we're on our second row, same string. Let me clarify that. We're now on the third row, same series. The current flow is still continuing in this serpentine path. And then we make our last bend here. Again, same connection. And then we're coming up our last row. And we're coming up on the 36th cell. So essentially, all these, one long series string, 36 cells, roughly 18 volts, half a volt each, all added in series. So we come up, and this is our positive home run. It's essentially the same as a negative home run, except for I have installed what's called a blocking diode. The blocking diode is essentially a one-way street where current can only flow in one direction. If it were a two-way street, then at nighttime, when no current is going out, it would be pulling current from the batteries, which if you think about the fact that you spend all day charging the batteries, the last thing you want to do is use the same panel to suck all that energy out of the batteries at nighttime. So we wire it in series, always on the positive string as well. So you want to make sure that it's the positive wire that you're putting that in series. And to do it in series, you basically just have it as a continuation of the wire, just solder on both ends. And one important clarification to make is that if you are using a charge controller, you don't necessarily need a blocking diode. Blocking diodes perform the same function that charge controllers can do, and that is to prevent current from flowing back into the panel. So, and again, it comes out the same hole that the negative wire comes in, so we're using one hole for both. And what's very important to do is to make sure that you've really got that hole sealed up tight. You don't want anything coming in through that hole. And then also, you know, you can move the panels, you can move the leads, and really you don't want the inside to move very much. So as you can see, they hardly moved at all. And you know, you come out, you strip back a little bit on the very end so that you can do your testing. And you want to make sure that you wrap them with electric tape, because it doesn't really create much of a fire hazard. I mean, you can tap them together under sun, and the panel is essentially short-circuiting right now, but solar panels don't really have a problem with that. But just for safety's sake and for good practice, always wrap them when you're not using them. And so that pretty much wraps up the wiring of the panels, and now we'll get into the putting down the surface, the plexiglass.
So here we're going to go ahead and take the cover, the plexiglass. You use this because it's quite durable. You know, things will bounce off of plexiglass that would otherwise break glass. And when you're working with other sorts of glass, it can be hard to cut. Like if you've got tempered glass, you're pretty much stuck with the diameter or the dimensions that you've dealt with. So here, I have pre-drilled some pilot holes into the corners. Anytime you're working near the edge of plexiglass or any glass, you want to be very careful. Just going ahead and screwing in screws can prevent or can create some problems and some cutting. So before we do that, I want to just go ahead and lay a bead of silicone sealant down. What this does is kind of helps it stick and provides a little bit of a barrier from the elements getting in here.
But now you don't need to go all the way down with it, because I like to do the last couple turns by hand for kind of quality control, because as you can see, the drill can move pretty fast. And if you're talking a half turns, the difference between cracking the plexiglass and not cracking it, it's a little bit too close to call with the drill. Now I'm going to swap this out, and again I'm using 2 bits. I'm just kind of run in line with this one. Essentially the small bit bit's more or less the pilot hole. The larger bit is just so that the screw is not actually cutting into the plexiglass, because I don't want it to rip, because we're pretty close to the edge here. So just make sure to keep it down so it doesn't ride up on the drill. Two more screws on the sides. And the reason for this is, again, the thermal expansion. If you don't put any in the side, what's going to happen is the plexiglass is going to heat up a little bit quicker than the wood, and it's going to try to expand. Once it's locked in at all 4 corners, it's going to bubble up. So, depending on the size of your panel, you may want to put one in here as well. But, you know, if you're only doing 3 rows of 12, you might be able to get away with not doing it. And if you're doing 4 rows of 9, you may be able to get away with not doing it as long as you have the silicone. However, if you don't, just keep an eye on it. And if it starts to buckle up, you want to make sure to touch that down as soon as possible, because any little bit like that, you never know what could get in there. So I'm going to hand crank these last couple. And again, don't get too close on it. Just the head of the screw can go in just a little bit, but don't go too far or you will break it. So I'll move it out of the way for you here. I know it takes a little longer to do it by hand, but trust me, you'll be happy when you finish and you don't have any cracks. Okay. So if you want, once this is all dried, you can come back with a file and file down the edges of the plexiglass. It's actually pretty easy to work with the file. That way you can flush it out with the side. Not a big deal. More than likely you're going to be mounting this somewhere and it's not going to be handled that often, so quite honestly it won't matter if it sticks out over the edge a little bit. That's just you know, a call for you to make. But so now that we're done with this portion, we're essentially done with the whole panel. But there's one last thing that is pretty important. You know, no matter how well you've made these joints, there are still going to be some gaps. So I just like to run some more of that silicone, you know, just down the length, fill in those gaps. You know, a lot of times it's the edges that are the most susceptible to moisture infiltration. So you can either use a wet rag or your finger. And, you know, if you want to repaint the edges after you're done, that's fine. But this stuff will dry clear. It'd be hard to tell it's even there. Except for when your panel's still working after a bunch of years. Then you'll know. So you just want to go ahead and do that around all four sides to make sure that you've got the best seal possible. And once you're done with that, you can tilt it up and you've got your finished panel. Here we are with our finished panel here. It's a fully functional 75 watt panel. And as you can see, there are 36 cells, all wired in series. Each one's half of a volt, so when they're added together, we're looking at about 18 volts nominal, and that's enough to charge a typical 12-volt deep cycle battery. And again, you want to use a deep cycle battery because it allows them to discharge at a deeper depth. So what we want to do now is make sure that there's good sun. It doesn't have to be complete exposure, but you want some good sun, and we're going to test the voltage and the current. So, starting off here, I've got them locked into the voltage here, and I'm going to measure that first and foremost. So as you can see there in the reading, we're looking at 18.4 roughly, which is right in tune with what we're looking at. So we're going to switch this over now. Okay. And now we're going to be checking the current. So each cell is between 3 and 3.5 amps. So when wired together, that should still be consistent and remain the same. Looking at about 2.8 amps right now, which, considering the fact that, you know, there are some clouds and it's quite hazy at this point, is actually pretty good. With all these wired together, they're about 3 to 3.5 amps a piece. So we add that together, we've got our 75 watts. And, you know, coming off of the solar panel is direct current. So we're looking at the direct current going right into the batteries, and batteries run on direct current too. Now, if you want to run AC appliances, where, you know, most appliances you've ever seen in your life are AC powered, then you'd want to get an inverter. That inverter essentially takes the power from the battery that you've provided with the solar, inverts it to AC power, and then just gives you a standard 120 volt plug coming out of it. So, you know, that's a way that you can turn this direct current into alternating current and power just about any appliance out there that you want. If you're dealing with stuff with higher voltages, then you could just wire a couple more panels in series and to up the voltage. And if you wanted to charge those batteries a little bit quicker, you could wire another one of these in parallel, because remember, parallel adds the amps and then series adds the voltage. So we've got this at about 3.5 amps. You put one more with it, you're looking at 7 amps. You're still sticking with that 18 volts, which is ideal for charging a 12-volt battery, but then you can charge that battery twice as fast. So, you know, basically this is a modular system. If you need more power, just get more panels wired together. If you need more storage, just put more batteries in series. So, you know, that's basically the rundown of under $100 75-watt solar panel.
Thank you for viewing our video. We need to say a few words about safety right up front. Safety is an important factor to consider before using any of the information contained in our materials. Please know the information contained in this video is not a substitute for professional contractor services. You should contact professionals and/or experts for assistance and advice as necessary to safely and properly complete any implementation of the methods and systems described in this video. To that end, please remember to review and obey your local laws and codes. Now, the following is a disclaimer from our lawyers. Please review it before proceeding. Thanks.
So I'd just like to take a moment and talk about a little trip that I took. 16 weeks, almost 4 months. I went down to Nicaragua to do some solar work. There are 2 companies down there that I worked with. One was an NGO, a non-government organization called Grupo Phoenix. That's actually the company that I was involved with working down there. But being as I had a background in solar, there was a commercial for-profit company called SUNY Solar as well that I worked with. I'll start with Grupo Phoenix. They're up by Honduras, up in the hills in northern Nicaragua, in this tiny village called Sabana Grande. And essentially, the university in the capital of Managua, in the engineering and renewable energy department, kind of branched off and formed this company, this NGO. And their initial mission was to help landmine victims, give them purpose and some, feasible way to provide for themselves and their families. So, after all the atrocities from the 80s, there are tons of landmines left all over northern Nicaragua, and there are many, many victims. So essentially, this group from the university went up to Sabana Grande and took these people who, had engineering pasts and were very capable mentally, but had, limbs that had been destroyed by landmines. So they trained them how to make these solar panels and how to essentially market them to the community. And what they did is they kind of partnered with the community and started installing these panels. And from there, it's just grown and grown. They just got a grant just a couple years ago, and from that, they were able to build a huge solar center. So I was basically there helping them build the panels, helping them just kind of do their daily routine, trying to see where I would fit in best and where I could help them the most. So I did that for roughly half the time. And then the second half of my time there, I went down to the capital and lived in the crazy capital of Managua, where SUNY Solar had just won a contract from the government to install 924 solar panels on schools all over the countryside. I mean, from the southwest to the northeast, all points in between and everywhere. So we spent about two and a half to 3 months traveling the countryside installing these little 100-watt systems that were essentially charging, 3 compact fluorescent bulbs and enough extra power to charge a little inverter where they could plug in a TV and watch educational programs on a VCR. The people in the hillside in Nicaragua, they're desperately poor. I mean, it's the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere besides Haiti. So they're desperately poor, and from the time they wake up to the time they go to sleep, they're working the land, doing whatever they can to get subsistence and provide for their family, put food on the table, take care of their livestock so that they can eventually sell them or, get food from them somehow. So it was quite a humbling experience going out there and seeing these people. And what these lights will allow them to do is work all day, and then when the sun sets, they can actually go into these classrooms and study. And so the adults can go back to school or get schooling that they were never afforded, learn how to read and write, kind of learn what opportunities are out there and progress and get, better jobs. Kids are actually able to learn to read and write at, a young age instead of growing up illiterate because they have no other options, because their option of going to school during the day just does not exist. So, like I said, it was very humbling to live and work amongst these people who basically would eat rice and beans every day. But just to see how far-reaching solar can get and how big of an impact it can provide these people all over the world has just reiterated to me the importance of solar and why we need to really stick with it, and the whole world will be adopting it soon.